Hi everyone, welcome to episode 21 of Demand Decoded. Thanks for tuning in and taking the time to join us. And today I'm joined by Phil, and we're going to demystify email nurturing and I suppose discuss why it simply doesn't work and what you can do instead. And while we will share some logic and personal experience to explain why email nurturing doesn't work, we've actually managed to dig out some real data for our own email nurturing campaigns from a few years ago. So we're going to analyze the success of those, hopefully give you a bit of insight, maybe a bit of comparison there. So should be interesting. So I'm not sure about you, Phil, but I just get the feeling this is going to be a good episode.
Absolutely. I think we think that about most episodes because we're excited to talk about these topics. But yeah, this is interesting. You know, my personal experience of email lead nurturing has been pretty universally disappointing. And like a lot of marketers, I suspect, for a long time, I blamed myself, and I worked very hard on iterating and testing and improving what I was doing within my lead nurturing, flows and strategies and so on. But, I've seen enough examples now, I've reviewed enough data, and I've talked to enough companies and their marketers to know that actually, it's not us. We are not the problem here. There's there's more than one fundamental flaw in the premise that email lead nurturing is based on, that does, render it problematic. And so it's been quite refreshing for me to step away from that way of doing things and explore alternatives. So it's going to be good to talk about that today. And to add to your point about real experiences, real data, I hope we get some comments and questions from people listening, because I know we're not alone in this frustration. And I know it's hard to admit sometimes that something that the rest of the world is saying is, a surefire silver bullet solution that everybody should implement, when it doesn't pan out that way for us individually, it's quite hard to go public with that fact. So this is a safe space. We can talk about, what has and hasn't worked in our email nurturing.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, totally echo all of that. And it would be great if you do want to join the conversation. You can just comment on LinkedIn and then we can have a chat around it. If you have any questions about what we are saying, feel free to pop a comment on LinkedIn. But we can dive right in anyway. And I think a good place to start would be to actually look at the original intention of lead scoring, because I feel like nurturing. Well, yeah, we'll talk about how they link as well. But in terms of email nurturing, it doesn't come from a bad place necessarily. It's a good intention there, and the promise of it does make sense. What are your kind of thoughts on the overall intention of it?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I've got to be honest and say I don't know the true origins of lead nurturing. I don't know what came first, the desire to do it or the technology that made it possible. But as is the case with a lot of things in marketing, it's here now and we're compelled to do it at scale and iterate on it and optimize on it. And when it comes to the intention, again, there's probably quite possibly a separation between what was the true original intention that led to its development and the intention that we all hold in our minds when we approach it. But for the most part, whether we like it or not, our intention when we do email lead nurturing is to move people through the purchase process, to take an individual who's divulged their contact details for one reason or another, and send them stuff that we think, when we sit in our marketer's seat, fits the model, fits the journey they are going to go on, and align the content that we send them to that in the hope that it will move them, nudge them one step at a time along the purchase process. And I think that although it may not always be all of our intentions to focus on how many customers we generate at the end of it, it eventually becomes the obsession. And although there's lots of uses of nurturing or automation, some better than others, I reckon for the most part, we're all obsessed with how many people it moves, how far down our version of the marketing funnel. And like you said, it makes a lot of sense to marketers when we look at, trying to model things and help buyers and do things at scale. But if you scrutinize it a bit harder and you look at it through the buyer's eyes, you might find there's less sense there than we first thought.
Yeah, I suppose when you look at the intention of, well, I'm trying to get across how it's kind of just guesswork, and even the intention behind it is essentially guessing and guesswork, like trying to identify a stage that a lead is at a particular time based on something they've clicked or something they've downloaded is pretty impossible. Like buyers move on this complex journey in such unpredictable ways. It's really, really hard to tell how much influence one piece of content has to move them on that next stage. And, are there even stages throughout that? I get like the intention is there. They download this piece of top of funnel content. So, okay, they're just starting their journey. That's the intention. Is it really true? Probably not in most cases.
I think to some extent, models are part of the problem. Models are very useful because they help us, structure and think about things, but they can create the false sense that we can control them, and that we then start to really align our activity to the model rather than to the true, individualistic determinant body being that's going through the process, the buyer. And so I think overly, leaning on models to drive decisions is part of the issue there, perhaps. So it's good to know where to sort of draw the line in terms of, analyzing using a model to segment things and assuming that your buyers will behave in accordance to a model, which they don't.
Absolutely. It's just not linear like that.
Yeah.
So moving on from the intention of it, which I think we've ironed out, what are some of the main reasons why email nurturing simply fails to convert leads into customers?
Well, there's a few, and the prominence of different reasons I think has evolved and changed over the years that it's been sort of a marketing topic. So if we go way back to when I was sort of really kind of first trying to get it working in a predictable manner that was aligned to what conventional wisdom is about it, the conclusion I draw about that period of time is that, like it or not, these emails are not having a material impact on the buyer and their reality, right? It's not through the medium of sending a couple of emails, you can't increase the level of fit between the lead that you have and your solution offered, right? You can't materially change how applicable it is to their specific situation or how attractive it is to them at any point in time. You also really can't change their urgency, the pressure they're receiving from elsewhere or not. You can't increase urgency, desire, appetite, suitability. So you're sending these emails, which are landing in an inbox, which has increasingly become a disaster zone. And, the hope, albeit a sort of subconscious or fairly removed hope, is that it will have this material impact on the psychology or the behavior or the action of the person receiving it. And it doesn't, and we've always looked for predictability and reliability in what we do. And no matter what approach I took over the years to segment differently, approach it differently, tackle it in new ways, I couldn't reliably get to the point where I felt like these emails, these messages were impacting the buyer in ways that produced the action that we were looking for at the time, which was a signal that they'd moved to the next phase, the next step of the model of the buying journey.
Yeah. And I suppose that you kind of said the changing times and the effectiveness of email nurturing. So how do you think that's different to where we are with email nurturing today going into 2024?
Well, that's all of that is still true, that emails that we receive for the most part don't have a material impact on our feelings and our thinking, but the thing that's developed is the fact that everything's based on who you're able to target, right? Who you're able to communicate with in this way. Fundamentally, who's in the lead pool. And the thing that we've seen develop over more recent years is that, for a number of reasons, the people that are in the lead pool that have converted in a way that you've got their details and you can nurture them via email are increasingly less likely to be people who will buy. You know, we've talked about this in other episodes where I think buyers are increasingly intentionally remaining anonymous, declining to share their contact details with the dozens of companies that they, you know, encounter on a daily basis as they're researching a topic, because they know what happens. And a big part of what happens is what we're talking about. Email lead nurturing fires off straight away, and they get, you know, 3 to 5 emails over a period of time or more. And so if the people that can and will and want to buy from you aren't in the lead pool, aren't in the lead database, aren't converting, then the lead nurturing emails that you're sending are even more likely to land on deaf ears, even less likely to correlate even with a success, let alone cause it, and, you know, and just disappear into the ether. So yeah, if we're not seeing buyers into the lead pool in the first place, email lead nurturing isn't going to be an effective way of communicating with them for any reason, let alone moving them on the purchase process.
Yeah, you're not nurturing people that will actually become customers. You're just nurturing people who were slightly interested in your piece of content, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to email nurturing, thinking about my experience with it, you know, for like 5 years or so, like, it's actually quite easy to do from a marketing point of view. Lead generation, lead nurturing, lead scoring is all fairly easy and methodical when you line these things up. It's not actually that difficult to, you know, perfectly line up your lead gen, email nurturing, and lead scoring to make marketing and those particular marketing metrics look absolutely amazing. You can manipulate it just enough so you get a good number of MQLs, but you can also still justify that there's a bit of intent there because they've, you know, completed these few actions or whatever. So yeah, it's a fairly easy marketing technique, I would say, to drive those results that aren't necessarily measurable impact, but kind of can make marketing look good if you are measuring like leads, MQLs, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The other thing with email nurturing, just a bit of a side note, is actually how much time I know that I used to spend on trying to perfect these workflows in HubSpot, these email nurturing sequences, and the detail you go to line up all of this content. You know, you might have 10 emails in here that are segmented into different sections, and you're putting all of this effort in, hours and hours of time to optimize open rates, optimize click-through rates, and segment and all of this stuff. Like, for the sake of a few contacts, you might only have 10, 20, 30 people going through this email nurture, and you're spending hours and hours to try and manipulate this tiny minority of your market who are probably never going to buy from you anyway, and try and convert them into an MQL that you can then pass to sales, and they're never really going to buy from you. Yeah. So yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? And when I think about how effective it actually was, probably a rough estimate of, you know, lead nurturing and scoring models that I work with, you'd probably see high intent MQLs convert into customers at around 10%, but low intent nurtured MQLs wouldn't convert into customers any higher than 2%, really, genuinely speaking.
Yeah, and that's based on your real experience, your, you know, real data. And furthermore, I think, you know, it's impossible to tell, although I would wager, how much of that was simply correlated rather than causing. You know, email nurturing happened at the same time as an MQL progressing, or a lead progressing to MQL or pipeline. I saw when I looked at our data and I compared it to others that we were working with at the time that, almost exclusively buyers were bypassing that whole process. They weren't part of it. They weren't engaged with it. And even when, it's not unusual with digital marketing strategies for marketers to, with good reason, try to optimize the metrics that are within the mechanism, optimize the open rate, optimize the click-through rate, optimize, etc. But ultimately, you can optimize the hell out of those and still get nothing out at the end in terms of pipeline and so on. So it's important to have that holistic view. And I spent a lot of time, like you, trying to work out different ways to segment and nurture my audience, initially to improve the strategy metrics, improve open rate, improve click-through rate, improve what we would call goal completion rate. But when you start to look at pipeline and you see that no matter what you do over here, you're not materially impacting that over there, it's another reason to sort of reassess what you're doing and where you're spending your time and money.
Yeah. Okay. Well, on that point, should we actually bring up the funnel report that we kind of teased at the start as a starting point here? So I'll talk us through this. Feel free to jump in, Phil, at any point. So I wanted to pull together some real data for this episode so we can actually genuinely look at the effectiveness of email nurturing. And the best data that I have to hand is our own at Blends. And fortunately, these email nurturing sequences, workflows were only deactivated. They weren't deleted like some of the others. So I think there was 4 left in our HubSpot, which, probably need to get deleted now, but it was handy for this anyway. So this is a funnel report in HubSpot that is filtered by all date range and contacts who have essentially enrolled in one of our email nurtures, which are actually from 2015-16, because I think from, is it 2017, potentially you turned it all off. So what we're showing here is, funnel report in HubSpot, which shows lifecycle stages and all the people that entered lead lifecycle stage and went to MQL, opportunity, and customer. And again, these are people that were enrolled in an email nurture workflow in HubSpot. So what we can see here, 77 people became a lead, 5 people became an MQL, 0 opportunities, 0 customers. So what that's showing is obviously the overall conversion completely throughout each lifecycle stage is extremely poor. But I think, it's fair to say like MQL wasn't perhaps being used as much of a function in terms of scoring. Is that right, Phil?
It wasn't as consistently applied as it is now. It represents a similar thing in our sort of scheme, if you like, but it wasn't being applied in the same ways or as consistently. But yeah, nevertheless, the chart, which fortunately is backed up by lots of other charts I've seen, it's not only ours, confirms that generating leads, sending them emails based on the nurturing philosophy was not a reliable way of turning those leads into pipeline or revenue. And that we've seen play out again and again.
Yeah. So it was able to turn a few into MQLs, but none into opportunities, none into customers. Now, interestingly, if we take out MQL from this funnel report and have a look at how many leads who, again, were part of our email nurturing workflows, then became opportunities and customers, improves slightly. So here we have 77 leads, 8 of those became opportunities and 3 became customers. So what you can kind of see here is that people are starting to bypass even becoming an MQL in the first place and actually just end up becoming opportunities and customers anyway. And obviously I won't show this exact data, but when you do then dig into these 8 opportunities and 3 customers, you quite quickly see that the email nurturing had no effect on their progression to opportunity and customer, they were going to become an opportunity or customer anyway without the email nurturing. It's just the fact they engaged with that first piece of content. And I suppose gated content in 2015, 16 was quite popular and people were more willing to consume that type of content. But the actual emails had no impact whatsoever. Like they were becoming opportunities or customers anyway.
Well, they may have become an opportunity before the email nurturing even happened.
Good point.
Which I wouldn't be surprised by, because it just doesn't align with what buyers want from the companies that they engage with and encounter on their travels. And every day we're looking for solutions to problems. We're visiting sites. We're trying to educate ourselves. We're trying to consume content. And if the vast majority of that behavior results in emails flying at you, it's just not aligned to what you're trying to achieve with your valuable time. So yeah, this is very, very indicative of the data that we looked hard at and optimized around, which was to say that we've tried some pretty wild and different approaches to lead nurturing. I thought I'd cracked it once. I read an article online from someone who I thought was a genius in that moment about reverse lead nurturing, starting at the bottom of the funnel and progressing up. And I was like, yes, if someone converts, like this data shows us, the intent to become an opportunity, the intent to buy is there, maybe there then. So strike while the iron's hot. Send them instead of it being the third or the fifth email in the workflow that says, talk to us, send that email first. And I was like, oh, this is great. This is groundbreaking stuff. Had no impact. Same result. Absolutely the same result. So, really worked hard to try and make it work. But at the end of the day, buyers, had their way. They told me quite clearly what they wanted, and it wasn't sequenced emails in their inbox.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that if people watching, listening were to do this kind of insight and reporting, whether it's a funnel report or simply looking at the number of leads who came from high intent sources. So inquired on your website for what you do, whether that's talk to sales, demo, trial, etc. If you compare the number of those MQLs, let's call them, that converted into customer with the number of MQLs generated from email nurturing and lead nurturing activity, you'll see a huge difference. Like the percentage in conversion rate will be eye-watering.
Yeah, I mean it's standard split funnel analysis again, right? Because lead generation, lead nurturing, lead scoring, and most SDR activity is focused on, from a marketing perspective, the same cohort of people, the leads. That makes sense, right? And it's all targeted at those individuals. It's all targeted at that data. And then you've got the other cohort, which is the people that were anonymous to you until the point that they became a high intent conversion, indicating their interest and their intent. So that you've got these two very distinct groups of people that self-report, the split funnel analysis shines a light on very clearly. So it's the same thing we've talked about before, because you won't be doing, a whole heap of aggressive lead nurturing on high intent bottom of the funnel conversions. They'll be talking to your sales team straight away.
Yeah. And we've kind of touched on the metrics you should be looking at there, really. The metrics you should use to analyze the performance of email nurturing. It isn't those in nurture metrics like open rate, well, the amount of people you're getting in, then the open rates of the emails, the click-through rates of the emails, the amount of leads that you're then able to nurture and score into MQLs. Like, we really need to look beyond that to see its true effectiveness and to justify the time and effort that's spent on email nurturing. Because if you did look at that and the conversion into opportunities and customers, you'll find that there's no point really putting the time and effort into it anymore.
Yeah, indeed. I think you covered that quite nicely.
Awesome. So I suppose whilst we are talking about why email nurturing doesn't work, we're not necessarily saying email automation as a function, as a tool, is completely useless, because I think it's absolutely not, right? There's still ways to use this.
Yeah, absolutely. There are better ways to think about potentially the intended use of email automation in the first point. And anyway, what's a better use of it now? And when I say this, I'm thinking specifically about a piece of content that was written by Velocity Partners, because they explored this topic in an article they wrote, which I've always held in high regard, which is that if you use it to educate a population, an audience, not one individual that you want to push along the purchase process, which is where most of us end up going in our brains. But if you think about an audience and you're using automation to either educate them or provide them with a really, really slick, good experience, then those are two potentially better use cases. It's also true to say that in lots of systems and platforms, the same tools that let you do email lead nurturing, the same automation tools that you use for nurturing, have lots of other use cases internally: data processing and management, internal communications, and those are very valuable to businesses as well. Big fan of that in particular. But on the sort of outgoing external side, for this whole period of time that I've been kind of either anti email lead nurturing or moving away from it, I've always seen and believed in the impact that a simple blog digest, for example, has as a method of educating an audience that has willingly converted into a lead. You're not hoping that blog digest will push people on the buyer's journey, move them through the funnel, move them into the pipeline. That's not your expectation or hope. Nothing about what you send out in that medium is sales oriented. You never need to give in and try to shoehorn in a talk to us or a buy this now or a take a demo. You're just sending content that you've written and published to an audience that have potentially willingly invited you to send it to them. And for years, we've seen that those emails get pretty good open rates, pretty good click-through rates. It varies dramatically with subject line and how interesting the topic is. And it's a great way to bring people back to your website again and again over a long period of time, potentially years, which is sometimes what it takes, and is sometimes another reason why lead nurturing ultimately can't measurably be shown to do any good, because the time it takes somebody to get into a position to want to buy, to act on the purchase, intent that they have, it can be years in the making. And you're 6 months, even at 6 months, when I've seen lead nurturing flows that last 6 or 12 months, it's pretty eye-watering to try and, diagnose what's good and bad about it. Like, you can't, you just can't do it. But a blog digest can run for years, upset no one, and keep them coming back again and again and again. And it's educating your audience. And I think when conversion, if this is ever the case, when conversion is a necessary or highly preferable part of delivering something to a prospect of yours, whether it's an event of some sort or it's a really specific kind of proposition and you end up converting them, of course, automation gives you all the power to be able to make that experience really great for them, follow up, distribute the content, send the right things afterwards. But it's really important to try and stay away from the notion that, beyond just closing that loop and making sure that single experience is good, that you're not going to then try and start moving people along with, well, here's the middle of the funnel content, here's the bottom of the funnel content. So I think there's use cases that are like that. And Velocity Partners, Doug Kessler said, maybe email nurturing should be called email noticing or lead noticing, because you're noticing what buyers are doing in response to the content you're sending. The content you're sending isn't making them do it. And that's, I think, a large part of the reason why the results are so, minuscule at the end of the day, because your emails don't have an impact. Your leads have an impact on you when they go and look for an email you've sent them, potentially.
Yeah. The thing is, though, would you consider an email digest as nurturing? Because I'm not sure I would.
Well, great question. I'm going to go out on a limb and say yes. I'm going to say it's the only acceptable form of lead nurturing.
But the word nurture makes me think that you're trying to grow something, like you're sprinkling the water over it. You've got the plant food out in there. I don't know why I'm going down a gardening analogy. It just makes nurturing makes
Well, I
me
think
think of
no,
plants.
it's a good analogy that others have used too. But to your point, yeah, you're trying to grow something. You're trying to grow their knowledge. You're trying to grow their skills and abilities. What you shouldn't be trying to grow is the desire they have to purchase, or the level of progression through your model of your purchase process. But if you're sharing your knowledge, sharing your content, growing their education, for want of a better word, then I think it's great. And I mean, when it comes to uses of email automation, that has always, stood out for me as a consistently, in terms of producing that critical thing that we look for, that predictable, beneficial outcome, it's kind of always delivered it. Whereas all the effort that you pour into, building a flow that takes people on a journey from step one, step two, no, we never got anything from that really.
Yeah, I suppose would one way to look at it be like almost using email as a way to not push somebody through stages, but just know they're at that one stage and do the things to help them at that stage. Like, for example, if they downloaded that piece of content, might be an optional download, or like you say, just something that somebody really wants to gate. It might, it could even be an event or a webinar. Somehow you've got these email addresses. If you're then just putting them into a digest, you're just appreciating that they're at that stage of kind of education and research, and well, not even research, education, and distributing that educational content. Likewise, like another way to use it could be, email automation. When somebody submits that high intent form on your website, if they don't go on to complete the action you want, then some automation behind that to kind of assist them in that stage.
It's a nice idea, but I suspect that it's hard to achieve in reality because of the limited resources we all have, and the fact that it's all predicated on content creation. You would need, in theory, to create a constant stream of content for people at specific stages of the pipeline or the funnel, and then have your targeting actually reflect them being at that stage. And we know now from the Gartner work that's been published, this year, people are never at any stage. They're all over the shop. So I think it's a wishful notion. But it's just really hard to stay away from the idea that I'm going to craft 3 emails, I'm going to send them in over this schedule, and I'm going to look for movement towards my desired goal. And yeah, and when you consider to just what extent we're targeting the people in the lead pool, although very valuable, all important people, they're not the people who are going to buy over the next 6 or 12 months. For the vast majority of cases, it's wasted effort. You can be creating other things that will drive more demand, create more pipeline with that time and money.
Absolutely, yeah. And even my best hopes to actually link up multiple email nurtures from the 1 week one and then send them into the other workflow, that's like 3 months, and then you've got a re-engagement one, perhaps, like all of these, and it never worked.
No.
So like you said, there's likely much better ways to use your time, use your budget, use your effort, your resource outside of email nurturing, because simply it doesn't work anymore. So do you want to kick things off on what are some of those, or that thing you should be doing instead of email nurturing?
Well, ultimately, anything Well, no, yeah, okay. I didn't mean that way, but ultimately, knowing that the buyer is going to stay out of your lead pool if they possibly can, then you need to be doing things that align to that preferred buyer experience. We've skipped over the point where you actually prove to yourself that that's not working. Do this instead. I don't know whether you're going to come on to that, but yeah, we know now that buyers don't fill in forms to download ebooks. And therefore, if you put your hard worked, hard generated quality content behind a form, the buyer is not going to see it. Whereas if it's ungated, then they can see it, they can read it, it can help you be found and discovered, and it can produce higher conversion rate at the bottom of the funnel. So I'd be largely, you're creating a lot of the same content. You're sharing your knowledge, your expertise, your credibility in various formats, publishing it freely for consumption, distributing it more widely than you might do otherwise if you're investing a lot of time on lead generation and lead nurturing, activating it on social channels, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are the better use of the time and the budget and the resource than lead nurturing email stuff.
Yeah, like you said, and I can touch on the, first of all, proving to yourself that email nurturing doesn't work, which we kind of touched on, I think, with the report that we showed and the metrics you really should be looking at. But I think Phil mentioned the split funnel analysis, which is a perfect way really to look at what you should be doing instead of these things. It's a great starting point really to understand what's ineffective, what's effective. And if you just Google split funnel analysis, by the way, you'll see a blog from us which shows you how to do it. I don't have it up right now to show you, but there's a video there too. Essentially, what you're going to look at is all of your lead sources. So that might be from gated content, events, webinars, like tools like Zoom Info, outbound, and high intent sources as well. So website inquiries. And if you track the number of initial kind of stage leads you're getting from there, all the way through to opportunity and customer, then you can start looking at things like ACV and CAC and pipeline velocity of all of these sources. What you're likely to see, prove this to yourself first, but what you're likely to see is that the high intent leads that you're getting convert into opportunities and customers at a much, much higher rate than anything else. So that leads you to come up with the conclusion that you need to be putting more budget, more effort, more resource into getting more of those high intent leads. And to do that, then you need to start looking at how you capture more demand, how you create more demand, and all of the strategies to start doing that. Really,
it's really interesting to me, and hearing you talk about split funnel analysis again, because it's so valuable and so important. It's really interesting that lots of marketers are data savvy and lots of them are data obsessed. We've all got tons of measurements and metrics and tools and reports and dashboards, and we can and do analyze click-through rate of individual emails and links, open rate of them as well, and so on. We put a lot of attention and effort into that. And yet so many have a blind spot when it comes to this all important effect on pipeline. Now, in some situations, that is driven by, KPIs and goals. And I understand that, ultimately, if you're in a company where you can't influence, or you feel you can't influence the big picture strategy, and you're measured on leads and MQLs, then okay, maybe you're going to do certain things that align to, as you mentioned right at the beginning, making that look as good as it can, which is fairly easy for the most part. But it is so important, and I hope that we encourage some marketers to look over there and look at what the end result of all the effort is. And then even if they do that, perhaps the hardest part is to accept that what's written as kind of gospel for marketing, may or may not always be the right way to do things. And I guess put yourselves in the buyer's shoes, use your own experience as a blueprint for how you go to market, and like break the addiction to things that are, they have marginal gains, marginal success, and take a huge amount of effort, because it's so exciting when you do. It's so exciting when you do things and you see the impact in terms of opportunities and revenue.
Yeah.
And we've all got the data and we've all got the tools, but you just got to look at the right part of it with the right mindset. And I hope that that's the effect we have on someone.
Yeah, we have had a comment here from Alison, which isn't really a question, but actually something I do want to talk about. Back in the day, you research your prospect, put in a good, honest cold call, got a result. It still works. I did it yesterday. So we're not really talking about email nurturing here, more just outbound, right? Fair enough, right? Like if that works for you, fair, like good on you. Lots of enterprise businesses, even SMEs, still do outbound, like still have some success with it. It might account for, like 30-40% of their revenue. There are cases where it does work. I would like to challenge how repeatable, sustainable this method is when you compare it to kind of like the win rate of things through your website, for example, if that is a channel you'll utilize it in. But yeah, any thoughts, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to me because it is the model that so many businesses are running. It's the playbook they run, and it's what they attribute their success to. And yet there's so many sort of hidden truths, I think. So just earlier this year, LinkedIn published a report which demonstrated that actually the groups of people that sales reps that are doing cold calls and booking meetings that way, the group of people that they're targeting are vastly different to the people that marketing are targeting. And I don't think that's a failure of either group. I think it just goes to show that, you can't market to people and force them through the process. And the sales reps that are doing the cold calling and doing the meeting booking, they're doing it at high volume. We know that their, meeting booked rates and conversion rates through to pipeline are, as marginal as a lot of lead nurturing's, success metrics. And it's a whole heap of effort. I also know that myself and lots of buyers like me abhor cold calls, and I don't predict an improvement in that situation, at scale. I'm always fascinated to hear, how successful businesses are doing cold calling, because it doesn't work on me, period. And we know from Chris Walker's work over at Refine Labs that he's seen vanishing these small return rates from this type of method. And what we do know is that it's actually really quite straightforward to generate very high intent leads through marketing if you deprioritize lead generation, lead nurturing, lead scoring, and you focus on giving the buyer what they want, which is a self-directed, self-educated decision, and you put your knowledge and your credibility out there in ways that they can discover, consume, find freely. And when you read Alistair Corsi's Diary of a CMO, there's a great page in there which is about their shift from lead gen to demand gen, and just how quickly their pipeline numbers exceeded their lead gen days. So we are talking about marketing and we are talking about lead generation, but there are similarities between the sort of the mass outbound model, which is generate a high volume of stuff, activity, leads, contact all of them multiple times and get 2% close rate, whereas high intent leads we've seen typically close far higher rate into revenue, and that's the way I'd prefer to grow.
Yeah,
so it's a really good point. It's interesting.
Yeah,
probably not my personal area of expertise either, gotta say.
Same here. There's a bit of a cold calling chat going on now.
Well, we might need to get a guest on.
Alison said it depends on the quality of the call, which maybe you're just an excellent cold caller. It probably, is a bit outside of.
Try me tomorrow, Alison.
Phil will send you his number. Actually, I'll send you Phil's number so he's not aware, and then you can, give it a go.
It's fascinating to me because I've never been in a room and seen it work. It really is interesting to me. But we always looked at things through the lens of what are we generating through marketing for ourselves, for our clients, from content, from SEO, from whatever, and how can we make it better for our business and our clients' business? And that was focusing on pipeline generation. It's really the work that Chris Walker's done in terms of analyzing big business numbers that gives me the confidence to say actually there's a parallel here between lead gen marketing and SDR outreach behavior. The close rates are low. The meeting booked rates are low, and it takes a lot of work. And I like efficiency, so that's one of the things that drives me.
Yeah, there is one thing I would really like to know, Alison, if you want to drop a comment in again, is how that prospect got to you, because you said you researched your prospect, put in a good, honest call. Was that a prospect sent by marketing, or did you go out and source that yourself? Which in itself could be an issue. You kind of have marketing and sales both trying to do lead generation essentially, whereas like the Cognizant model that they then shifted to in terms of shifting sales onto enterprise accounts seems logical, because that might require more outbound, a lot more research, a lot more kind of education into these specific accounts to really deliver a great cold outreach. Would be good to know, but
it's intriguing. It's really intriguing.
You can chat afterwards. Cool. Yeah, I think we've kind of covered what you should do instead of email nurturing, really looking at doing that split funnel analysis, looking at how you can then create more of those high intent leads, looking at how those high intent leads get to you through things like self-reported attribution and other forms of kind of customer research and stuff, and doing more of those things instead of email nurturing, because you'll see it doesn't work for yourself. And going from there.
Absolutely.
Anything to add?
No. I mean, I think it really is just like the clarion call has to be take away from all of your leads, or rather MQLs or opportunities, take away the ones that stayed anonymous up until the point that they expressed their interest in you, and look at the conversion rate from the others into opportunities and pipeline. And that's usually enough to see that the effort isn't worth, the juice isn't worth the squeeze on that basis. And anything that you can do that increases the number of the other kind of inquiry that you get is far more valuable and has a far higher return on investment.
Absolutely. I think that's probably a good point to end on here, whilst I've got cold calling on my mind, and we'll probably talk about that afterwards. But yeah, let's wrap it up there anyway for email nurturing. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode of Demand Decoded. I really did. Be sure to follow the Blend LinkedIn page for future live events that you can join and kind of join in the discussion on. And you can watch or listen to any of the past episodes on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anything really. Just search for Demand Decoded. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.